So you can all see what this lecture is going to be about, and there is a paper to go with it called The Self, Agents and Actors. So you shouldn't be short of, script in case any of it is particularly obscure. I'm going to start with some words from John Paul II, our Polish Pope, about the sociological problem of conceptualizing the person, namely how to capture someone who's both partly formed by their sociality, by their life in society, but also has the capacity to transform their society to some extent. So he puts it very nicely indeed, and he says, quote, "Human beings are both child and parent of the culture in which they are immersed." Now, the interesting thing about that is quite how many philosophers, particularly postmodernists, totally disagree with him. So next slide, please. There are many famous ones who've written, whole books about the dissolution, the death of the human subject. So we have Lyotard, "A self does not amount to much." Michel Foucault, man would, I'm sorry, I will just be using man generically. I'm not a feminist, but it does mean men and women. Man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. And then Jean Baudrillard, humanity, that spongy referent, that nothingness. And then here we have Richard Rorty, socialization goes all the way down. There is nothing to us at all except what society has given us. So that gives you an idea of the opposition that both John Paul II and we are, sorry, I've got emails coming in, that we are confronting, namely that and this has been true for a long time, that there are two views of humankind. There is modernity's man, whose human constitution owed nothing to society. He was a self-sufficient outsider, if you like, who simply operated in a social environment. And on the other hand, there was a much later but pervasive over-socialized view of man, whose every feature beyond his biology was shaped and molded by society. So we call him Homo sociologicus. Going back to Hobbes, he was a dependent insider. He had no capacity to change the social environment himself. Every feature of him beyond his biology was shaped and molded by the social context. So I called him society's being. He works by being controlled by bureaucratic regulation, so every action must be directed from above. He lives as a role occupant, so his responsibilities are predefined. He's hostile to human cooperation, and he takes a role rather than making it, by personifying it through the values that he endorses. So he has no claim to human dignity. Homo sociologicus is just doing his job. Now, from the point of view of social realism, the main deficiency of these two models is a basic denial that the nature of the reality in which they live makes any difference to the people that will become or even are becoming people. So modernity's man, as you've seen, was preformed, and his nature wasn't a general shared human nature, wasn't dependent upon his experience of the world. In fact, he works instrumentally. He has preferences and goals, but where they come from is left completely obscure. David Hume talked about our passions. And this is very clear right up to today in rational choice theory, where there is no knowing where he has these preferences from, but all of his efforts and energy are devoted to trying to entertain them. And similarly, society's being is also a model which closes off direct interplay with reality. The whole of the world comes to all of us, it's argued by philosophers like Ron Harry, a good and very respectable friend who sadly died recently. But he had this idea that everything about us comes from joining in what he calls society's conversation. And through this, we become, again, his term, cultural artifacts, products of society. Now, realism cannot endorse this. It wants to sustain the idea that the way the world is can affect how we become, what we value, what we do, and what we say. And this is the case even if we don't understand, as is the case, of course, the whole of natural reality. So to give you a very clear historical example, take gravity as a concept in physics. Gravity affects us even though primitive, so-called primitive people, early civilizations, had no idea about gravity. But it had a profound effect upon how fast they could run, how high they could jump, and so on and so forth. And it's the same today. There's a lot we still don't know about reality, an enormous amount, as we become very, very aware during this pandemic globally. We just don't understand an awful lot about it. But it affects us, even to the point that it can kill us. So our knowledge is not the central thing. It's the nature of reality itself. That if you, swimming, take that as a positive example. Swimming is based on the fact that if you put a human body into the water of a swimming pool, it floats. We are floatables. We don't really have to do very much other than not be nervous to learn to swim. Just move our fingers, hands, and our feet, and soon we find, once the fear disappears and we relax, that we're propelling ourselves through water. But that's purely due to the interaction of our floatable bodies and the fact that the water supports us. So that is extremely important, and it's the source of the realist approach to beginning to conceptualize the human being. We have what we call a stratified ontology, meaning that any entity usually is made up of several levels. And you can see this very well in biology, for example, that things start off at birth being one way, and they can go through all sorts of processes and changes, becoming one thing, and then eventually developing into, say, a butterfly. And that's what we mean by a stratified view, that we are not born all of a piece as fluent language speakers, knowledgeable about the norms, the normativity of our culture that we happen to live in. These things come gradually through learning and through mixing with one another. So basically, the realist thinks of three levels. First of all, selfhood, that we have a continuous sense of self, that is, of being the same person over time. We may look back and think, oh, wasn't that terrible that I behaved in that way? But we couldn't have that thought if we didn't recognize that it was the same person behaving in a different, and we may now think deplorable way, as the me of today. And then at the secondary level, we are what I call primary agents. And you can look up the paper if you find any of this going too quickly for you. Primary agents are differentiated by their relationship to socially scarce resources. And that sounds very pretentious, but it boils down to meaning some people are born and at birth they are rich and others are poor, and so on and so forth. Now, some of these later on may transform themselves into corporate agents. That is, all poor people may, or many poor people may get together and form a pressure group, a political party, a protest movement. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can be a corporate agent. But the common denominator is that they want to transform the current status quo of the social. And then finally, and most individual, we have social actors whose identities are defined and secured by them investing themselves in social roles, ones that they personify according to their ultimate concerns. So those of us who become university teachers, it doesn't matter at what level, we are not clones, we are not identical, Our styles are different, our approachability is different, the way we relate to students and their problems and questions is different, the way we prepare for a lesson is totally different. And these are important differences. They have social impact as well as defining us. So these three levels are linked. I see the human self, selfhood, if you like, as being the grandparent, grandmother, grandfather. The social agent, where we are born, country, language, culture, and so on, as the parent. And the social actor, the one who actually chooses that I want to be a lecturer, I want to work in the university, is the offspring, the child. So human selfhood, let's begin with. We have to make a very clear distinction between the feeling of being a self and the social definition of what a self is. Now, those social definitions, concepts, can be very, very varied. But the sense of self, as John Locke said, as the anthropologist Marcel Mauss insisted, is somebody who knows themselves to be themselves. And they do that because of their interaction with reality. So even the youngest baby placed in a cot, a bassinet, or whatever you want to call it, when she accidentally kicks the bars of the cot or rubs against the fabric of the bassinet, there is an involuntary ouch, which stands for, I don't like that, it hurt. And the importance of that is already there is a self which tries to move away from the thing that is painful or irritating. And it will take some time before they can do this effectively. But it's very well worth reading the records that Jean Piaget kept of his own 3 young children as babies, showing how these reactions were formative, and how one's development was based upon the preceding development that went before it. So that's the basis of human selfhood. And the best way of showing that this distinction should be maintained is to demonstrate its necessity. That is, a sense of self must be distinct from variations in concepts of selves. Now, there is a pretty bad tendency in social theorizing, particularly in something that calls itself identity theorizing, that just because you are born male or female by sex, then that's what you are, and that gives you your sense of self. Of course, today many people challenge that, something I won't go into here, but it is necessary to have a continuous sense of self, as John Locke was, I think, the first, certainly, to give a full account of this, and to insist that this self is crucial. So if as a teenager someone had had great difficulty with their examinations and probably failed them at school, they might well, there's no determinism here, they don't have to, but they might well fear any exam that they then have to confront, like university entrance or the first degree or defending your thesis. And that seems to be the case. It's not the best argument for the continuous sense of self. The best argument is that there wouldn't be a society unless we had it, because not everything that we do in it and every situation we confront is bound to be one where we know what the social script is, what the appropriate reaction is. But then consider Antigone. Antigone is in a terrible position. She's forced in her society to obey two rules that are contradictory. That she must not go outside the city walls to bury her dead brother, and that she must obey King Creon, her uncle, and do what he says. Now, that's then down to Antigone, and I don't think she is just a historical example. I think we all face this business of having to write our own scripts. If somebody is rude to us, pushes in a queue, pushes us off a bus, the choice is ours. Do we respond angrily, or do we say something quite mild, like, I'm sorry, I was first, but don't worry. And it's always indispensable that we can produce performances that are not scripted, and yet they hold society together. Now, if we turn to social agents, we are, as we grow up, this is something we realize, we are born into a particular social class. We are differentiated. Are we rural or urban? We can be born into entirely different cultures, something you find still today in Norway, that the Sami tribes of the north speak Sami and are quite different from the Norwegian speakers of the south. And this has been a source of a lot of discrimination against them. So we become agents from our families. We acquire the properties of particular collectivities like class, and the kinds of agents that we start off being without any choice due to our parentage and natal context are profoundly influenced by what type of actor they can choose to become, because certain opportunities and information are available to the higher classes and not to the lower classes. Options are not determined, but the opportunity costs are much higher if you are working class and want to go to university and stick at it and get there than they are from solid middle class families that can afford to pay the fees and your accommodation and your book allowance and some spending money. So that is particularly important for where we start from. But finally, perhaps the most important thing of all is the fact that we develop our own personal identity. Now, where do we get this identity from? The realist argues we get it from our interaction with the three orders of natural reality, because it's maintained that a distinct type of concern meaning not to worry, but to care, a distinct type of caring derives from each order. So in the natural order, physical well-being is probably top of the list. And without having sufficient to eat, and not the right kinds to eat, of things to eat for well-being, we deteriorate. In the practical order, the way of doing things, particularly getting food, gaining a living, is dependent upon us being performatively competent. If you can't shoot an arrow, you are not going to kill either a lion or a deer. You will have probably nothing to eat. And in the social order, self-worth seems to be the primary concern. In other words, does our behavior constitute something that is admirable or something shameful? And one of the important things is how we know these things. And my argument goes that in engaging in these three kinds of activities, this gives rise to different emotions, which I just call commentaries on our concerns, plural, sorry. So in the natural order, we are engaged in object-to-object relationships. When I confront a lion, I feel fear. When you confront an enemy, you feel anger. If we all confront something to eat that really disagrees with us, we find it completely disgusting. Disgust comes from the desire to eject something, reject and eject. And if things go smoothly, the emotion is relief. I think even watching, little 5-year-olds swimming across the Bosphorus in Turkey, they are very brave and they're very good little swimmers, but most of them do have a look of relief when they get to the other side. In other words, it all went well. And then in the practical order, we've got subject-object relations. In other words, you can be forced if you're in slavery, or compelled, constrained, if you come from a poor family, to do a pretty boring, unrewarding job. And the emotions are ones of frustration and boredom, whose opposites, if you have an exciting and stimulating task to perform in the practical order, is satisfaction or even exhilaration. And in the social order, when we get to subject-subject relations, admirable or shameful, then the person is really subject to very, very different social responses. The admirable are probably given honours or promotion, or their advice is taken seriously. And the shameful, if they can't be banished, can be punished. And the punishment is meant to make them take a different attitude towards whatever it was that they had done. So concerns are very important, but there is a dilemma for everyone, because these three that we just saw on the previous slide are commentaries that may well conflict. It's very reasonable to feel physical fear in a war, and it's perfectly understandable why somebody would want to desert in order to evade being wounded or killed. But that runs the danger of endangering their self-worth through being a coward. And as you well know, in most European countries, there are legal proceedings for soldiers who desert or behave in a cowardly way. Now, boredom in the practical order prompts stopping an activity. If you're doing something, even playing a game that you find tedious, the inclination is to stop it. But that may threaten physical well-being through either failure to acquire skills or through failure to gain food or occupational rewards, money. And finally, shaming prompts withdrawal, and it may threaten your performative competence in the previous bullet point. So the dilemma for everyone, since these are not, absurd things confined, feelings confined to particular people or particular activities, there's a need for all of us to prioritize our concerns. And I call this trying to establish a modus vivendi, a way of living, a way of making your way through the world, and being able to reconcile these difficulties. So, your job may be boring for somebody, but if that's where the domestic income comes from, maybe their love of their children and their spouse just makes them determined to put up with it, see it through, just because of its importance to the family. So that dilemma is something that really is crucially important to our personal identity. It's crucially important because we have to work it out most of the time for ourselves in relation to these three types of concern that are inescapable and the particular forms they take in a society. And it's the precise balance that we strike between our concerns and what precisely figures amongst the subject's concerns that gives us our strict identity as particular persons. And it's up to us, and there's a long, long historical argument about our ultimate concerns, whether we have one or whether these can be plural. But there was little disagreement originally that constituted as we are, we cannot be unconcerned about how we fare in any order of natural reality. Therefore, a very important conclusion, therefore, these concerns can never be exclusively social. We have to choose. And another bit of commerce, sorry about that. So we have to configure the concerns that we have and the demands that they impose upon us. And there are many excellent novels that go away that deal precisely with this. I don't know whether it's translated into Polish. I should have asked one of my friends. It's a wonderful novel by Graham Greene called The Power and the Glory. The Power and the Glory. And it's about the trajectory of a Latino parish priest who starts off very self-satisfied with his very comfortable, quite well-off parishioners. And eventually, as his concerns differ, he comes to realize what his vocation demands. He ends up being a martyr. This trajectory, life trajectory he has been through, is not something that you can understand without understanding why and how his concerns change and develop. So that is, I really must bring this to a conclusion. It's our identity formation that defines us, that expresses how we are involved with the world. Some people, as you well know, can walk past a wounded person or poor person and they show no reaction. But importantly, our reactions to events are emotionally transformed by our commitments. So, for example, somebody who becomes, once they're an adult, becomes a vegetarian, emotionally is shocked at their past self who used to wear a fur coat. They just cannot believe that this was possible, but they know it was. And so we adapt our modus vivendi as we develop. And to achieve a satisfying and sustainable one is an achievement. It's not one that can be accomplished immediately, and it's certainly not possible to very young children, even young people, because they simply don't know enough about themselves or about the nature of the world. And this enables one to do a sort of sociological biography of people from age to age. I'm not a great believer in stages, but undoubtedly there's a difference between being under 10 years old and being over 20 years old, but it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. So that's our identity, which is perhaps one of the most important things about us, and an awful lot of sociology you'll find just omits this. It doesn't, like rational choice theory, it doesn't turn it into a methodology, but what it does do is to, unintentionally perhaps, I don't know, it ignores the differences between people. It ignores human potential, and it ignores our personal values, and how we monitor these. And this is far outside, to go back to the beginning, to finish off with, it's far outside the possibilities of modernity's man, who remains trapped in his own preference schedule. And in the same way, this is true of society's being, who can never react creatively to anything. She can never transform society's conversation in a radical way. They're ever condemned to making conventionally acceptable permutations on it, which makes them less of a person and maybe damages, if it doesn't deprive them, of human dignity. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions that you wish to raise in relation to this little talk, after you've read the paper, please, you're very welcome to my e-address, and I'll do my best to respond to you, though probably not by the next morning. Thank you all.